Museums Creating Community is a Minnesota partnership production, a co-production of the Minnesota Association of Museums, the Minnesota Historical Society, the Hennepin History Museum, and Twin Cities Public Television. Funding has been provided by an Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund partnership grant through the vote of Minnesotans on November 4, 2008.
Where am I in the museum? Where do I see myself in the museum? What do we know as a people? What do we know as a society of all of those individuals that contributed to making our lives as rich and full and complicated and tumultuous as it is today?
What do I need to know about the past? What is the correlation? What is the application for today?
If you want to call a story an object, and I do, it's still all about the objects, but I think we have a much broader sense of what the objects are and what they can mean. That's part of the spirit of museum going, right? You're hoping that maybe something will turn your head or open your eyes to a new way of thinking.
Audiences are coming into institutions with the expectation that they can actively participate in the thinking and the programs that occur here.
The 85,000 works of art we have in our collection are actually all owned by the people of our community. These works belong to all of us.
Can't check them out though or
No.
anything like that.
I can't borrow them.
Museums are moving more and more towards living museums, especially a museum like this where you're talking about culture and language and history.
In 1940, the Armistice Day blizzard was bad.
I believe the gentleman you've talked to is in his very late 80s or maybe early 90s, and he comes in quite often.
I was going to a country school then, and we got stranded out for a couple of days.
He knows the place. He feels a sense of ownership. And that's what really makes a museum. If there's not ownership in it, there's really no use for it.
Indian Country is one of the few places that you see veterans honored regularly in our society anymore. Every powwow you go to, you'll see a special honor song just for veterans. They'll start off with a grand entry song and then a flag song, and it's always followed by a veteran song. But more importantly, they don't just invite Indian veterans, they honor all veterans. I'm a veteran and have a long history of veterans in my family. You know, it is interesting because even myself, you know, when I was in the military, I questioned some of our government's involvement in different countries and different things like that. But this is our homeland. This has always been our homeland. The Mille Lacs Indian Museum and Trading Post, it's part of the Minnesota Historical Society. The new museum was built in 1996. The Trading Post has been around since the mid-1920s. One of the questions we get sometimes from kids is there still Indians, you know, here today?
There's actually 11 different tribes in Minnesota. Overall, throughout the whole United States, you know, there's hundreds of them, maybe even thousands. So the two guys over my shoulder here is my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather, Chief McGizzy and Chief Shabashkung. There were chiefs back in the mid-1800s up until the early 1900s. Their villages or people were the ones who chose to stay here at Mille Lacs during a time when the government was trying to get all the people from this area to relocate to northwestern Minnesota.
Keep it relevant, keep it contemporary, keep it living. We offer workshops, traditional knowledge, but maybe using contemporary materials or methods. Museums as a whole have come a long way to try to not just keep American Indians in the past.
Turnerism began in 1811 in Germany, and it was started by a man by the name of Friedrich Jahn. In 1848, there was a social revolution in Germany, and it was backed by the Turners, which were young men who were well educated. This social revolution failed, and many of the Turners then immigrated to the United States and started Turner colonies. one of which was in New Ulm, Minnesota.
Of course, there were people already here.
That's right, yes. And so another part of the history that we interpret would be the history of the Dakota culture, and then eventually the history of the Dakota War, which is one of the things that puts New Ulm on the map and Brown County on the map. People can come into the museum and study the Dakota War, the way you conduct research, the way you even install exhibits has changed so much over the last 30 years. Part of that's the technology and the use of computers and the use of digital images and the way you can even find information. Information has come out on the Dakota War that I certainly didn't know when I first started in the museum business in the 80s.
We're on the cusp of really a tipping point where our community goes from something that it used to be and something that it's perceived still to be to something completely different. The community, I think, interacts with the museum lots of different ways. People come into the galleries, people come to our programs, people come to our sites. They may come to our documentary film series. We try and get out in the community as much as possible, so I'll go to elementary schools and interact with their kids, or we'll see them at the county fair, or they'll hear us on the radio or see us on local television.
Stability, a sense of permanence, a sense of inspiration. Minnesota has almost 600 museums, which is one for almost every 9,000 people. Last year, there were approximately 6.3 million visitors to museums in the state. Most of them were small museums, the county historical societies, the little log cabins. Some of the top museums in the country are here in Minnesota. But most of them in small spaces are either run by a few people or a cadre of volunteers, and just about every museum has about 40 to 45 volunteers that work for it, which I think is a huge statement for how valuable those museums are to those communities and those individuals who are willing to devote their time.
When we first started this, it was a children's program. And it was Halloween, and a director and I thought, wouldn't it be fun to take the children out to the cemetery and teach them about fact and fiction? We weave the history of New Ulm and Brown County and the Dakota War in with gravestone symbolism. What are the different cultures in your county, and what do they bring to us, and what can we learn from them? And it's a hard task, but it's also something really enjoyable, and you can learn a lot from it.
We all remember the past very differently. And one of the things that objects do, it doesn't matter if it's an institution like the Walker Art Center that focuses on contemporary work or more historical collections. We often use objects to trigger memories, to trigger our understandings of the past. We're also in a time where the objects that have customarily sat in cases and frames on walls are being animated as we rethink their uses and therefore rethink our pasts. More voices, more stories. Inspiration is not just about seeing the effects of genius or of great talent over many years, but it's something that can happen to all of us. One of the fundamental things that artists do is they ask provocative questions. Those questions are about who we are, what we value, what we believe is beautiful. They hold a mirror up to our time, often in a way that makes us look at our assumptions much more closely and sometimes a little more critically.
When I first arrived here, I spent a lot of time listening to the board and staff and donors talk about what they cared about the most at the MIA. And the thing I heard loud and clear is that making our collection accessible to the broadest spectrum of the population was of the greatest importance. And of course, our free admission is one example of how we really like to make the museum accessible to everyone. We see hundreds of thousands of children each year on school tours. It's very exciting to be in our lobby in the morning as all the school buses arrive. I can't tell you how many people say to me, "Is it always like this?" Works of art themselves tell stories. Everything was contemporary once. Our collections literally span the whole of the globe and cover all of human history. If you want to see any of it, we have it here. We're sitting now in the Impressionist gallery, and it's so hard to think about that era when Impressionism was so radical that it made people angry and upset, and so we're a keeper of all of those memories.
Historically, people associate museums as being places of reflection, of contemplation, of looking at the past through multiple lenses. Increasingly, we realize that we live in a culture and a society now where our publics don't necessarily want to take a passive role. They want to be actively involved. Many people visit the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden. We've actually had 8 million visitors since the Sculpture Garden opened its outdoor doors in 1988. We very actively involve artists in our programming. Artists and members of the community come and program their activities and their events and their visions right here on the Walker campus. So it's not just about us creating programs for an abstract public, but for the public to come and actively engage the programs through being content producers themselves. The first question to ask is, how do we meet those communities where they are and understand what their needs are before we set the expectation that they will come here specifically?
We actually have a fantastic program here for people suffering with memory loss, bring them on tours through the galleries as well as their caregivers, and use it as a time for discussion and memories. We also have a program for veterans, so we do lots of sort of in-depth, focused community work. We're open late on Thursday evenings to accommodate working people. We use technology in the galleries. Sometimes our docents bring iPads into the galleries to just further expand on the historical information and the learning that happens in the galleries. My favorite definition of what is art is that it's an expression of what it is to be human.
We're all sort of agents of society. We want people to have an experience at the Walker Arts Center that will transform them, maybe in a small way, maybe in a bigger way.
Museums are institutions that live in their communities, and they look to solve problems that the community has identified. There are museums that are working with children in the juvenile justice system. There are museums that are working on hunger issues. There are museums that are working with new Americans.
Have you guys ever seen a horseshoe crab?
Yes.
Because museums have great resources available.
Is this like a shell?
They have facilities. They have collections in many cases. They have classrooms. They're able to mobilize an astounding number of volunteer hours because every week in this country, every week, Americans donate 1 million hours of their time to museums. Museums are extremely important because they preserve and interpret our country's great historic, natural, cultural, and scientific heritages. Museums are collecting institutions, but not all museums are collecting institutions. Those collections could be paintings, or as the CEO of the San Diego Zoo says, his collection is never in the same place the next day when he comes to work. But those are still collections, and they are institutions that use their resources to provide enjoyable educational opportunities for people of all ages.
Today we're respecting other individuals' cultures, and that's certainly change that we have seen evolve in the last part of the 20th century. In the past it would not be unheard of to have exhibited human remains. That's no longer acceptable.
Everybody's a part of history. The life that you're living now, the life of your parents and your ancestors, and the lives of your children and your descendants are all a part of what we call history. It used to be that museums thought, well, we'll put it out there because we're who we are. It's inherently good. People should, if they have the grace, they will avail themselves of our offering, and good for them. What's really changed is that we've gotten to know our visitors much better than we knew them in the past. We never really knew very well how people actually learn in museums. We know much better now. People learn how they want to learn in museums. Museum goers are their own bosses. When you understand this, it kind of produces a certain amount of humility for the museum. The museum has to step back and say, you know, just because I wrote it on the label, or I put it on the wall, or I put it in a case, doesn't mean it's important to anybody. What you got to think about as a museum professional today is how do you engage the attention of these active learners who are coming to your institution and who are looking for you to turn their heads and make them say, wow.
What is that from, do you know?
A buffalo?
Look at how thick it is at the top.
Whoa.
There's this feeling of now we're part of the culture. Now we can go to that museum.
There are only 5 of these left in the whole world.
Wow.
And they were built right here in St. Cloud, just down the road.
Yeah, this is what happened in the past, but how does it translate to what's going to happen in the future? Is there something that we can learn about it?
There it is.
The 2 young ladies that you spoke with were participants in our summer garden program, an exhibit called The Working White House from the Smithsonian.
The inner workings of the White House. We always see the president on TV, but we don't know about all the people who are working behind the scenes. I'm a native Stearns Countian, and so I can look at things and say, oh yes, that's where we used to go fishing.
Well, I like to draw pictures of the animal scene. I really like that a lot. I like the White House Garden Project. It was fun to plant the seeds, watch the plants grow, and then harvest, find out a lot of really cool things about nature.
When a museum is in a community, it brings in a lot of revenue to the shopping centers, to the restaurants, to the hotels. We had the traveling exhibit, a T-Rex named Sue here a couple of years ago, and in 12 weeks we brought in 25,000 people to St. Cloud, and they left money.
We're living in a global society where things are changing rapidly all the time. And so that puts a particular challenge for us to make sure that the new stories of new people who are coming to this state get collected, but also that they're represented in the broad face of what this museum is and what it represents. There was a way of thinking in the past which was that a museum was all about its objects, and the objects were the fundamental primary thing. We're at a point now in the development of the field where we see the entire museum experience and its potential for learning and for enjoyment as being inclusive of objects for sure, because they're a fundamental and essential part of describing and illustrating history. But we're also looking at the stories that these objects can tell. One of my favorite exhibits here is the open house exhibit. And this is an exhibit that's just about one particular house in one particular neighborhood of St. Paul. And it just happens to be a tremendous immigrant gateway neighborhood. Through the story of this one house, we were able to show what that experience was like for Germans who built the house originally, for Italian immigrants, through Irish, through Swedes. Today we've got Hmong people living in that house. And so by doing this exhibit, we not only told these wonderful stories, but we also gave people an opportunity to compare what the immigration experience was like. There's a kind of a spirit of pluralism that's always been in museums, but I think we're moving from an idea that was more about, museums providing some sort of grandiose moral uplift to the unwashed masses to something that's a lot more respectful and a lot more dialogical, where people's experience is actually changing how we think about our practice. And I think we're being much more reflective, much more open, and engaged with the communities that we represent.
What Sweden represents for a lot of people is a place that's really succeeded in fostering peace. There's a great reverence for nature, which has led to a lot of strategies for a sustainable society, viewed by a lot of countries as being a place that cares for others, that has a society of mutual respect. So I think that's what Sweden is recognized for today. The American Swedish Institute was established by Swan Turnblad, who was a Swedish immigrant who came to this country and became a very successful publisher of the Swedish language newspaper called Svenska Amerikanska Posten. With this wealth that he assembled, he wanted to build a home on the Minneapolis's Golden Mile, Park Avenue, built this house that was completed in 1908 and lived here for some time until 1929, when he handed this home over to the community. A lot of volunteers, especially women from the community, kind of swept in. Particularly Swedish and Americans here in Minnesota have always known how to organize. There's also a tradition in Sweden of folk school, people getting together to learn particularly about craft. Those crafts have really informed Swedish design, Swedish architecture.
Museums are very open to being sure that the right story gets told. Maybe historically the whole story wasn't told or the right story wasn't told. Museums feel a very strong obligation to be sure today that the story of our country and all the racial and ethnic groups that make up our great melting pot country, that their story is well told and accurately told.
Minnesota is one of approximately 6 states that do not have an African American repository dedicated exclusively to the history and preservation of African Americans within a state system. So we're very excited to be able to alter that landscape in this way. And the Minnesota African American Museum will, yes, tell the Minnesota story. We will tell the Midwest story, the region story, and it's not necessarily those individuals that were born and raised here, you know, that had a particular birthright. Those that journeyed through here, that left a footprint. We have so many stories.
The most exciting thing that's happening with the state is to see new museums starting.
The Culture Center mission is to preserve the Hmong culture and teaching the younger generation how to practice the traditional and also teaching the Hmong or the low income or Hmong people how to become English sufficiency. So we teaching ESL class, and we also teaching the refugee or immigrant who want to become U.S. citizen, the civics and law. There were many other Hmong organizations provide service to the Hmong people in the Twin Cities here. But the older people who come here and they see many of the younger Hmong who came to the United States, they are very busy in their work and school, so they not be able to train the younger people to respect and learn their culture and where they came from. So the elderly, they're organized and they're starting this organization.
Culturally specific museums are a very valuable type of museum. They oftentimes span a non-geographic segment of the population that's bounded by a culture. It also is able to call out those individuals that were important to that organization, to that group. The Children's Museum of Southern Minnesota and the Minnesota African American Museum, two really different impulses, but choosing a museum format to bring that impulse to bear in the community. And the Children's Museum of Southern Minnesota is a particularly interesting type of museum because as a youth museum, it's the type of museum that begins to encourage children that museum going is fun.
The real vision for the Children's Museum of Southern Minnesota is to create a space where we can all come together, and that it really is Southern Minnesota's new town square. And it's designed in a way that not only attracts families to visit, but it's comfortable for them while they're there. It's easy for them to be together as a family and to meet other families. While these families are there, they're able to learn something together as a family. There's something for everybody that really engages the direction of their own learning.
The Perlman Center is an interesting environment because it's not only an art museum, but it's an art museum at an academic institution.
It has cinema and media studies, it has a theater, it has dance studios. We call it a teaching museum to really underline the fact that this is not a temple for the arts for the elite. The Perlman Teaching Museum addresses multiple audiences, including students and faculty, the larger Carleton community of parents and graduates and so on, but it is very much also meant to welcome the community of Northfield, of Minnesota generally, and anybody who happens to be passing by. We look forward to welcoming you. We have an exhibition called Running the Numbers that presents photographs by a Seattle-based artist named Chris Jordan, in which he's presenting quantitative concepts about modern consumerism, like how many plastic water bottles are consumed in 5 seconds in the US, which is a huge, huge number. And he creates this image of all those water bottles that is absolutely mind-boggling. So those type of images are in the museum, and then we teamed up with a charter school and with the Northfield Middle School art classes, and they then did a project.
Where do we have the opportunity to share stories with one another? Where do we honestly encourage the kind of conversations, open, genuine, authentic conversations about who we are and where we come from? Museums generally always serve that role.
That motivation to collect, that motivation to present, to remember, speaks very strongly to Minnesotans' values. They do provide that opportunity for stories and accomplishments and achievements to not be lost, but to be gathered up and seen as a part of our past and a part of who we are.
I have a great deal of faith, actually, that people are capable of learning new things, of encountering new cultures and understanding them in different ways. And museums are actually a great place for doing that. They're safe, they're inclusive, they're open to everybody, and ideally, they're representing everybody's story.
Museums Creating Community is a Minnesota Partnership production, a co-production of the Minnesota Association of Museums, the Minnesota Historical Society, the Hennepin History Museum, and Twin Cities Public Television. Funding has been provided by an Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund partnership grant through the vote of Minnesotans on November 4th, 2008.